Snow came to the Northern Urals in early September. In the morning, when the shift quickly left the bar, the crispy crust was already creaking under tarpaulin boots. A red sign hung on a pole at the entrance. Geological Exploration Party, number 14. No entry for outsiders. Two yellowed slogans. The subsoil of the motherland calls, and a shock October for the land of coal, gleamed brown-red from the soot of the stove. The station seemed cut off not only from the country, but also from the present time. Party Chief Mikhail Malagin stood by the window, holding a half-cooled enamel mug. The world outside the glass was dim, like a worn-out postcard, a cloudy sky, barely noticeable lines of hills, black needles of fir trees, cloudy crosses of flags around the perimeter. Everything seemed in its place, but the March fatigue was already barely hidden under the autumn skin. The room was seething with the usual bustle. Lyoka, the youngest of the detachment, was fiddling with an oscilloscope, trying to assemble a new circuit diagram of the device before his eyes. His shoulders, stooped and stubborn, immediately gave away that he was a city dweller, not a northerner. Not again, Vorantsev grumbled, stomping on the boards in his felt boots. Yesterday your short one almost burned the wiring to the camp. Science requires sacrifice. Palak, Lyoka smiled, squinting through his thick lenses, but I'm here for the reporting purposes. Enough, Malagin said quietly. We've eaten. Time to go to the forest. Today to the northeast, down the highway. Someone sneezed behind the wall. There was a short, clear knock at the door. On the threshold stood a short man in a canvas jacket, darkened inappropriately for the weather. Dispatcher Chermukin, an old-timer, with a face the color of withered rape. Before sending off, our guys should look at the map, he quietly remarked, putting a bunch of crumpled sheets on the table. A supply officer from the Ministry of Emergency Situations brought me a cart, found in the peat by the river. Old stuff. But look, Michaelik, there's something strange on the back. On one of the drawings, faded and covered with faded signatures, a line had been hastily drawn in thick yellow pencil, zigzagging, as if the hand were twitching in a chill. Above it was carved, 7th Serpentine, 1850 to 193. Do not let in. Mostly it's crap. Chermukin chuckled. There were engineers here, and locals do shamanism. But it seemed like something always went wrong there. Malagin laid the map out on the table and began to study it. Everything seemed familiar. The horizon markings, the drilling point, the breakdown by wells. But the unfamiliar line looked alien. It either went deep into the hills or disappeared behind the blue spots of the rivers. On the list of names there were scribbles, dates. Smirnov SS, 1891. Polyakov VM, 1928. Below it was clearly visible. Disappeared 1936. At the same moment, Lyoka was leafing through a thin, spectacularly faded notebook found in the same package by the river. The first page was filled with calligraphic handwriting, almost pre-revolutionary. September 17th, 1876. We began unloading. The terrain is unkind. It's cold since sunset. It's uneasy by the fire. Then came short notes, as if hastily written by a hand that knew no rest. We found the entrance buried, strange signs on the board at the top like Cyrillic, but different after entering. Dizziness, time doesn't go as before. It becomes more difficult to write. Malagin read for a long time. It was getting dark outside, and the lamp above the map, like an old moon disk, cast a dim yellow light on the uneven lines. Major, Palak called. The radio is crackling again. There are no alarms, but the weather is getting worse. Maybe we should move the route. No, Molly Jin answered quietly. This time we're going according to plan. But grab a rope, a couple of carabiners, and a camera. Lyoka, grab that notebook. It seems to me that all this is not just a coincidence. Everyone in the camp felt a tinge of anxiety. Something was wrong. Before leaving, he wrote in the duty log, September 18th, 1982, 8:57. Group, 5 people. Direction, northeast, sector 14B. Objective, topographic survey and examination of the rock after the collapse. If we don't leave by 4, start searching. The journey into the thicket took half an hour. The air was sharp and frosty. Birch bark fell from the trees like dandruff from a tired old man. To the left, shadows of workers' barracks flashed by, half-ruined long buildings with darkened boards, where, according to Chair Muckin, exiles had once been kept for internal work. Past them was a crumbling brick well, inside which the frozen wind echoed. Everything here breathed the chronicle of oblivion. When they reached the hill, Lyoka noticed strange tracks in the snow, as if someone was dragging a heavy object along an arc deep into the rocky embankment. An old fragment of a fastener was visible on top of the track, a rusty nail of an odd shape. Further on, there is a low cliff covered with unfamiliar pictograms and 2 signs. The first is made of red copper, half-rotted. The second is clearly from the Soviet period, but burnt and with barely discernible text. Forbidden Zone, 7th Serpentine. Just like in the notebook, muttered Malagin. If only we had these pre-revolutionary engineers here. Lyoka glanced around the entrance. The rolled earth, a crack behind which a passage could be guessed going down, wide enough for exactly one person. When they dug into this layer with a shovel, fine, dry sand suddenly fell. A copper plate flashed in the gap for a minute, and behind it, deep darkness. Palak extended the shovel back. This hasn't happened here for ages. Maybe we don't need it? Malagin checked his finds log and patted it on the hard surface, out of habit. That's it. We'll keep our bearings on this dashed line. Let's go, since we've already broken the entrance. Liko doesn't throw it away, but for some reason notes never like it when they're actually read out loud. The group bent down in the passage, making their way inside one by one. First, there was a sharp temperature drop. Damp, hard to breathe. The flashlight cut through the sticky, slightly dusty darkness. A board slammed behind them. The rubble settled a little, covering the tracks with snow. Once inside, everyone felt as if time had stopped. For some reason, the grip of anxiety grew stronger. Even their gait became awkward. The walls were glaring, and peeling nails and rusty pins could be seen in cracks here and there. Scratches appeared between the stones here and there, symbolic, not of our literacy. The first meters passed without adventure. But in the farthest corner, someone felt a metal plate, green with age. On it, in addition to unfamiliar symbols, 2 lines could be discerned. The passage is open. Time is twisted. Whoever entered without memory will leave without a trace. Malagin clutched a plastic case with a camera in his hand. Take pictures of everything, Lyoka. Don't forget to record even the dirt. Every centimeter, so that you don't have to reconstruct the route from memory later. There's something ancient here rewound in the Soviet style. The passage went deeper. The steps echoed loudly. The breath whitened in the air. The lantern snatched broken helmets. Then an old leather flask. Then a rusty plaque with the coat of arms of the Empire. At the end, when the route spiraled for the 3rd time, a sign flashed by again. Dates, inscriptions, names. At the top, F. Malagin, 1982. No one had such a mark until they looked at the sleeve of Malagin's jacket. Someone had scratched his name with a needle. When? Suddenly, it became clear. Here memory does not work as it should. Water dripped from above. From the depths came a barely discernible echo. Footsteps, as if the echo of one's own boots had been delayed in time. Palak caught something heavy with his foot. A bunch of keys ended up in the mud, with a note tied to them in gray, charred paper. On it, in pencil, "Don't look at the turn. Don't think about those who are lost." Malajan wiped his forehead. Everything resembled a long, viscous dream from which it was impossible to wake up. But now it was impossible to return. The corridor behind him seemed to have narrowed. The traces of past steps had disappeared, and in the darkness, someone quietly pronounced their names. At the very end of the path, at the third descent down, they stopped for a rest. The magnetic compass was spinning madly. The camera showed only a veil of fog, and Lyoka suddenly stood up and said in a strangled voice, "Have we been going around in the same circle all this time?" Malajan didn't answer. In his head, the heavy echo of one simple word, scratched on the wall of the passage, rang time, and in his pocket the old, battered key began to vibrate again, the same one he had once found at grandfather's. A closed circle of 7 spirals, 7 passages, 7 names, and each time the passage calls in a new way. Thus began their journey to the 7th serpentine, to where the past and the present were locked in a death grip, where all memory, all pain, and all history were locked in a ring. And behind their backs, the doors slowly began to fall in from above forever. The chapter is finished. The story immediately draws you into a mystical reality, gives you characters, an alarming atmosphere, and a hook. There will be no accidental death here. There will be something much more fundamental, disturbing at the level of memory and fate. The dead silence of the dungeon muffled the sounds of life. Only half an hour had passed since the team stepped beyond the edge of daylight, but already it seemed that time was dripping differently. Each step into the darkness echoed inside, as if with the echo of someone else's thoughts. Lyoka walked second, squeezed between Palika's massive shoulders and Kostia, who was still grumbling cheerfully. Ahead, Malajan's lantern cut the thick, viscous semi-darkness into scanty spots of light. Behind, closing the line, Chermukin was quietly breathing down their necks. His steps were inaudible, but for some reason the air smelled of lightning and iron. The tunnel walls were roughly worked, as if someone had chopped them with an axe hundreds of years ago and then hastily sealed the cracks with a clay slab. Light spots sometimes appeared on the cut edges of the pink-brown stone, salt deposits, or something else resembling porous bone. Every step became harder. Someone stumbled and swore quietly through their teeth. A long echo went along the passage, as if someone had answered in a whisper in the depths. It was cold and stuffy, and ahead a dim, lake-green circle of a lantern flickered. The group moved again along a looping trajectory, as if the tunnel deliberately forced people to return to the same dent in the wall, where the date was scratched, 1928. Polyakov VM. At some point, Kostia stopped abruptly, raising his hand. The others almost bumped into him. He looked at the chipped wall for a long time and suddenly extended his finger. "This is my grandfather," he exhaled hoarsely. "Last name, initials." They were looking for him here. For a second, Malajan felt as if something had snapped inside him. He had a sense of a break in time, an illusion that somewhere in the depths of the tunnel, the ghosts of old people were actually sitting, leaning over a barely burning lantern, just as hopeless of getting out. At that moment, Lyoka noticed another nuance. Below the names, mixed with Cyrillic, strange, angular symbols were visible, similar to knots or loops. He ran his finger over them. The stone was wet, and the symbols, as if fused, either glowed or seemed brighter for a second when his fingers touched them. Chermukin whistled through his teeth. "I told you, this is no place for young people. Locals don't come here. There's a swamp under the floor and a rock on top. All the time mixed up." Palik took out a flask, took a sip, and passed it along the chain. The humid air did not quench his thirst, but only added to his fatigue. "Okay, Malajan said firmly, cutting off the fuss. Let's go another 100 meters. If there are no new finds, we'll come back. We'll make a diagram, contact the base later, let them call the specialists if necessary. Further on, the passage became wider, as if someone had recently dug it up or filled it in. A crack in the ceiling was black, and thick, stinking water was dripping from it. On the floor, in a pile of rubble, they found fragments of wooden boxes. On the surviving piece, there was an ornament of double-headed eagles and an illegible ligature, Timin. Lyoka picked up the scrap and put it in a sample bag. Further on, the tunnel came out into an extension, a small room. Everything resembled an old abandoned church. The ceiling was vaulted, and on the sides stood the remains of benches or seats. On one of the walls was a large date, 17/11/1878. Below was a copper plaque, worn out by time, but two phrases were clearly visible under a layer of green oxide. Aline Sergeyev, engineer of the third category, was here. Whoever enters, there is no way back everywhere. The air in the room was especially thick, as if filled with radioactive dust. The camera, as soon as Malajan picked it up, suddenly blinked and went out. Attempts to click the slider did not produce any results. The film seemed to have melted in the cassette. It looks like we're already on the edge, Palak muttered. It's complete wilderness. Suddenly, somewhere behind them, the earth slammed. The last one in the chain, Chermukin, reported in a quiet voice. I think the passage has collapsed a little. It looks like we've shortened our return time. Don't be dramatic. Malajan waved him off, trying to speak calmly, but with each word his voice became quieter. Suddenly, it seemed as if the ceiling hung so low overhead that it was about to close in and become a second skin. Lyoka, trying to break the silence, asked hesitantly, or maybe this isn't a grotto at all. Maybe mine's like old catacombs? On old maps, there were camps here. There were only us, people, and maybe something else. Chermukin snorted angrily. The group suddenly noticed that along the walls, in the solid mud, boot prints suddenly appeared, not their size, as if others had walked here before them, or others after them. Kostya read in a low voice. Time! Lyoka jumped up, examining the fresh trail. It wasn't me, and not me, Palak answered dryly. Malajan waved his hand, again setting the general direction, deeper, even further along the winding spiral. Further on, the corridor became narrow again. The walls were covered with scratches, in some places clearly human, in other strange places as if left by claws. One corner was thickly scribbled with words. Someone had been typing the same thing for a long time and madly. 7th, 7th, 7th. Then the hand clearly slid down, breaking off the phrase. Another 20 minutes passed. The torch was already dying. The group stopped only long enough for one of them to write down the time on his wristwatch, 13:24. As soon as Palak finished writing this on the wall, for some incomprehensible reason, a rare alarm clock began buzzing in the back of Lyoka's pocket, the one that had never been wound up. Something rustled in the darkness. From the gloom of a distant branch of the tunnel came a strange groan, or perhaps a knock, repeated as if in time with their breathing. Chermukin suddenly fell to his knees. It's not people who dream here, but the earth. His words echoed through the vault, and a moment later they disappeared, as if he had never spoken them. The others froze, listening tensely to the muffled echo. At that moment, Kostya stumbled, walked away in the darkness of the passage, and disappeared from view for a second. Everyone rushed to him and found Kostya cursing under his breath against the wall. His hand was stained with fresh, as if very recent blood. A date appeared on the wall, 1936. Polyakov V.M. It's Grandpa. I swear it was him who wrote it. Kostya was breathing heavily, tears glistening in his eyes. The air ahead became thicker, cooler. It seemed as if the floor was vibrating slightly, as if invisible wires were running underground or ghost trains were passing. The group gathered, barely containing the oncoming hysteria. "Now we're leaving," Malajan said firmly. "Back." They turned and saw that part of the tunnel behind them was slowly crumbling into sand. The exit had become narrower. The light from the lantern was breaking on the rubble. "Faster, damn it," Palak yelled. Everyone rushed back, bumping into walls, rusty rivets clinging to stone growths. At the last moment, Lyoka picked up a piece of mirror from the floor and saw himself in it. But behind him, in the reflection, stood a man in a tunic from the early 20th century. He looked intently and silently. Lyoka dropped the mirror and ran after Malajan. After agonizing minutes, they jumped out into a stone room where there had been nothing superfluous before. Now 5 new names appeared on one of the walls, and they were all theirs. Even the dates were today's. Malajan was the first to understand. No one leaves here the same. Everyone has already been here, a little earlier, a little later. The past and the present are entangled, and every step only draws you deeper into this loop of time. The chapter ended alarmingly. In Lyoka's pocket, there was an old pre-revolutionary coin, which he hadn't had in the morning, and the hands on Kostya's watch stopped exactly at the same place where his grandfather had disappeared in 1936. Behind everyone's backs, the door to ordinary life seemed to have slammed shut forever. The air in the stone room became thick, as if someone had dissolved invisible dust from old books and rusty iron in it. Malajan sat on a fragment of a stone bench, twirling a compass in his hands, the arrow of which was spinning helplessly, as if drunk. Time was clearly not moving as it should here. His wristwatch showed 14:17, Palaka's 13:52, and Lyoka's hands had stopped at 12:30. "The equipment is dying," Palak stated gloomily, tapping his finger on the dial. "The radio is silent, the camera is dead, and now the watch too. It's like we're in some kind of dead zone." Chermukin sat a little further away, methodically fingering his rosary beads. No one remembered where he got them from. His weathered face had turned earthy gray, and his eyes were looking at one point on the wall, where their own names were visible. "Not a dead zone," he said quietly, "alive. Too alive. Time is layered here, like peat in a swamp. Every year a new layer, and underneath all the old stuff is still there." Lyoka giggled nervously. "What is this, a lecture on the geology of time?" "Old man, you're scaring me." "But it should be scary," Chermukin snapped, "because we're no longer the same people who came in here." At that moment, Kostya, who had been standing silently by the opposite wall all this time, suddenly disappeared. He simply dissolved into the semi-darkness, as if he had never been there. The other four looked around, emptiness. Only the echo of someone's steps, going deep into the tunnel. "Kostya!" shouted Malajan, jumping up. "Where are you going?" There was no answer. The lantern snatched from the darkness only stone, rusty spots on the walls, and strange, seemingly living shadows that moved against the light. 10 minutes of agonizing waiting passed. Then uneven steps were heard from a deep branch of the tunnel. Kostya appeared in front of the group, but he looked strange. His geological jacket was stained with clay and some kind of black liquid. His sleeves were rolled up, and on his hands were old scratches that looked like they had healed many times. "Kostya, where have you been?" Malajan grabbed him by the shoulder. Kostya looked at me with an unfocused gaze, as if he had woken up after a long, heavy sleep. "Don't remember. I was walking down the corridor, and then there was another room. There was a man in an old tunic sitting there. He told me. What did he say?" Malajan asked sharply. That time here is not a river, but a wheel, and that my grandfather is waiting for me. He showed me something, a notebook, I think. Kostya reached into his pocket and pulled out a tattered, leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellow, damp in places, and the handwriting was painstaking, calligraphic, clearly pre-revolutionary. Malagin took the book and opened it to the first page. It read, Diary of Survey Work. Polyakov Vladimir Mihailovich, second-class engineer. 1936. Malagin's heart sank. It was Kostya's grandfather, the same one who had disappeared in these parts almost half a century ago. Read out loud, Kostya asked hoarsely. Malagin turned over several pages and began to read. August 15th, 1936. The entrance to the underground gallery was discovered. The locals warn that it is not a good place. But duty is above superstition. August 16th. First day in the tunnels. Strange thing, the compass goes crazy and everyone's watch works differently. Technician Smirnov claims to have seen his own name on the wall, but when we went to look, it was empty. August 18th. We are lost. Or no, not lost. We are simply not going where we want. The galleries lead us according to their own laws. Today we found a room with bones, human, but old. On one skull were glasses of the Soviet model. How is this possible? August 20th. I had a strange dream today, although it was real. In one of the rooms, there was a group of people in modern clothes, future ones, I think. One of them looked very much like my Commander Molly Jin from the military unit, only older. He was looking straight at me and writing something down in a notebook. Malagin stopped, feeling his hair stand on end. The 1936 entry mentioned him, Malagin, who had not yet been born at the time. Go on, whispered Lyoka. August 22nd. I finally understand. Time moves in circles here. We meet those who will come after us, and they see us who came before them. The gallery is a wheel of time, and in the center of the wheel, something sits. Something old and patient. August 24th. The group has broken up. Smirnov went ahead and never returned. Technician Voronov has gone crazy. He claims his wife is calling him home, although his wife died 2 years ago. I am left alone. August 25th. Last entry. Found the central chamber. There is an altar there, not Orthodox, not pagan, but some other kind. On it lie the things of everyone who has been here. Things from the past and from the future. Pre-revolutionary coins and Soviet passports. Old guns and modern devices. I understand now. This place gathers time into a knot. Everyone who comes here leaves a part of themselves and takes a part of those who were here before. If my grandson is reading this, run. Run while you can. And if you can't run, then it's your time to become part of the wheel too. V.M. Polyakov. The silence was ringing. Kostya slowly took the diary from Malagin's hands and pressed it to his chest. He knew, he whispered. He knew I would come. At that moment, a strange sound came from the depths of the tunnel, either a grinding or a howl. And along with it came a coldness so strong that the breath turned into white clouds of steam. We need to move on, Malagin said firmly. There's nowhere to retreat now. We're trapped in time, and the only way out is through the center. They moved deeper into the spiral corridor. The walls here were covered with an icy crust, and the floor was strewn with strange objects. Soviet badges, Tsarist rubles, modern lighters, scraps of newspapers from different eras. As if someone had been dumping here everything they hadn't managed to take with them in normal times for decades. In one of the crevices, they found a skeleton in a decayed military uniform. Next to it lay a faded medal for courage and a student card from Moscow State University, dated 1975. The man clearly died here in the past, but had with him an item from the future. This isn't normal, muttered Lyoka, picking up a modern record book from the floor. Look, My faculty is here, my specialty. But the last name? Krymov. I don't know him. I know, Chermukin said gloomily. Krymov, Alexei Pavlovich. He disappeared in these parts in 1963. He was a geologist like you. Everyone felt a chill. Lyoka was holding the record book of a man who had disappeared 20 years before his birth, but the specialty, faculty, even the group number matched his own. We are repeating the paths of others, Malagin said dully. Every generation comes here and goes the same route. Time forces us to play the roles of those who came before us. Further on, the corridor widened into a huge cave. In the center of it, on a stone elevation, stood a strange altar, a flat slab, strewn with objects from various eras. Ancient icons stood next to Soviet orders, pre-revolutionary pocket watches, next to modern transistor radios. And around the altar, leaning their backs against the cave walls, sat figures in decayed clothing. Dozens of people from different eras, pre-revolutionary engineers, Soviet geologists, modern prospectors, all dead, but their faces were calm, as if they had simply fallen asleep. There was an open book on the altar. Malagin came closer and read the title. Chronicle of the Seventh Serpentine. List of all who entered and did not leave. He turned over several pages. Names, dates, short notes. Sergei Vai, 1878, remained the timekeeper. Polyakov VM, 1936, remained the timekeeper. Krymov AP, 1963, remained the timekeeper. And on the last completed page, in fresh handwriting, was written, Malagin M.A., 1982. The entry ended, but at the bottom of the page, someone wrote, Time has turned. A new caretaker has been found. The old ones can retire. Malagin looked up. One of the figures by the wall, an elderly man in a tattered tunic, slowly opened his eyes and looked straight at him. Hello, grandson, said the ghost of Grandpa Kostia quietly. We've been waiting for you. Tom stopped in the cave, and behind the group, a rustling sound was heard. Sand began to fill the last passage to the exit. The seventh serpentine was finishing its next circle and starting a new one. The deepest cold creeps not under the jacket. It is settled somewhere between the breath and the heart, when you understand. In this place, the space is deaf, and your traces do not stretch back, but multiply in different directions. Malagin felt this immediately, as soon as he stepped into a new, somehow unnaturally quiet corridor, behind which the noise of footsteps and the hubbub of the group remained as if in a previous life. He didn't know whether a minute or an hour had passed in the dark gut of the tunnel. At times it seemed as if someone was walking next to him, sometimes behind, sometimes in front, sometimes breathing from the side. But if he looked back, there was only the sound of his own steps and the dull metal of the hobbled flask. The flashlight picked out only the unevenness of the rock, sometimes other people's names hastily scratched with a nail. Smirnov, 1891, Gerasimov, 1952, Akrotov, 1978. The lines shifted closer and closer to the present, as if an invisible scriptwriter wrote them in as new expeditions arrived. At the end of the uneven ledge, something misty and barely luminous spread out. It seemed that a high green cavern was beginning. At the entrance, someone scratched a name on the damp stone again, V. Polyakov. The damned feeling of being stuck became almost tangible. Suddenly, a silhouette emerged from behind a ledge on the clay wall. A man in a tunic without shoulder straps, with an angular face as if carved from wood. The light of the lantern caught the features of Grandfather Kostia, those same faded eyes in which something stern and bright always measured. Don't expect light, Mikhail, he said in a faded voice. This is a ring road, not a road. Malagin lowered his hand with the lantern. There was no doubt This was the same Polyakov who disappeared in 1936. The damn name was again lined up on the general sheet. "Why are you here?" asked Malagin, not recognizing his hoarse voice. "Because everyone who is looking for a way out is here," the grandfather answered. "I went deep until I realized you only go into yourself. Into the past, into the future, it doesn't matter. There is no counting forward or backward here." At that moment, somewhere behind, where the group remained, a muffled voice shouted, "Mika, where are you?" Lyoka's voice was filled with panic and anguish. Malagin didn't answer. It seemed that his voice wouldn't pass through the viscous thickness of the air, or what's more dangerous, that it would sound in a dozen different times at once, and each echo would take away a piece of his memory. "You could have gone out," the grandfather said slowly, "if you had walked behind yourself and not looked back. But Serpentine does not let go of those whose last name he has chosen." Malagin remembered Kostia's diary, then his own name, scratched with a needle on the sleeve of his jacket. "All roads led here? Why?" "Because we drag memory along with us, like the tail of a cart. Everything that is not let go becomes a door here." A grimace of pain crossed Polyakov's face, but immediately disappeared. "Tell your grandson that he must find his own questions. You can't take on other people's debts as a way out." At that moment, the tunnel shook. Somewhere the rock crunched, and a bunch of wet clay fell from the ceiling onto Malagin's shoulder. The group's calling voices were heard again. Lyoka and Palak were desperately calling for their boss, breaking away and getting tangled in other people's shadows. There was a dull rumble, as if a train had passed over a distant railway bridge at night. The sounds became normal again. Malagin rushed toward the light, but miscalculated his pace, and instead of reaching his own people, he found himself in a stone pocket with another plaque, a heavy copper plate with 6 names engraved on it. All were clearly legible, except for the bottom one, where someone had scratched a new name, Malagin M.A., 1982. He recoiled, hitting the back of his head painfully on the ledge. A white spot burned into his vision. The flash of the flashlight picked out a row of old, charred bones piled along the wall. A modern metal watch, like the one Kostia had, glimmered on their fragments. And something else, a leather flask with a faded star, a soldier's ID from the 90s, a broken transistor radio, a performance of material lost eras. Suddenly a familiar silhouette flashed nearby. It was Lyoka. His cheeks were gray, like a statue. His hair was covered in ice. His gaze was piercing. "There is someone here, very similar to me. No, it was me, but about 20 years older. Here's the watch. Here's the jacket. Misha, we've all been here once before." Malagin raised his hand to his face, wanted to say something, but his lips seemed alien. Behind him, a groan was heard again. Palak was dragging Kostia along. He was beside himself, muttering scraps of superstition. "That old man explained everything to me. He knows how to leave along the ring." "That's it, we're leaving." Malagin barked, and, gathering the rest of his strength, he led the group back. But the tunnels had changed. The familiar route had suddenly become looped, the walls had shifted, and the corridor they had come down had ended in a dead end of collapsed rock. "I warned you," the grandfather responded, dully somewhere in the emptiness. "There is nothing behind you here except yourself. People only leave here if they agree to forget their name." Panic overwhelmed the entire group at once. Palak rushed to look for the entrance. Lyoka whispered incoherent verses, obviously from those he learned as a child to keep from going crazy. Chermukin knelt down and began quietly repeating names, his own, others, mixed up. Only Kostia had a strange clarity. "We need to find the very first room, the one where all our names were. If we go back there, we could try to leave everything alien here and go out. But hundreds of new corridors went into darkness, darker even than the cold night outside the train window in winter. Every step was given by a creak in the knees, a crack in the back of the head, a dry squeak of the lantern. Time became strangely elastic. It seemed that you were walking for a long time, but everything around was flashing in jerks. Now old inscriptions, now new ones, now the voice of a grandfather right behind your back. Now a hoarse cry of yourself, but as if from the past. When his strength was almost gone, Lyoka suddenly stopped. Look, there ahead, it's glowing. A dim blue glow was pouring out of the side passage. The group moved there. It turned out to be a small room, similar to a crypt, where the walls were completely covered with tablets with dates, and in the center lay a massive diary on a pedestal. Malagen came closer and saw. The last pages were already filled with their names, today's dates, but the record of death and death had not yet been made. At that moment, a hand appeared in the air, right in front of him, as if from nowhere. Its skin was wrinkled and dusty, but Malagen recognized it as a ring with a letter P scratched into it. Kostia's grandfather looked straight into his eyes. Give his place your name. Only then can you return to the light. Mikhail, his voice trembled, but he brought up the pencil he had scratched in his field bag that morning and carefully, in calligraphy, wrote, Malagen Mikhail Alexandrovich, 1982. He was here, but he left. At that moment, the diary burst into flames in his hands. The walls began to vibrate. A draft hit his faces so hard that the dust swirled like a snowstorm. The world shook and suddenly settled into place. Everything went quiet. When they came to, a thin notebook had crumbled into ashes at their feet. Next to it was a helmet, a flask, a coin, a piece of a modern camera. All the objects were old and new at the same time, like themselves. A tiny crack of daylight filtered in through the wall. What had once seemed like eternal darkness was now a short cleft between the boulders. The group, exhausted, climbed to the surface. Only Palak was missing. He disappeared in one of the turns during the escape, and no one heard his last words. In the daylight, the faces of the expedition members looked unrecognizable, silent, 10 years older, with heavy shadows under their eyes. Malagen touched his cheek. Under his fingers there remained a thin scar, which was not there in the morning. The wind carried the shaman's song along the slope, and somewhere in the depths of the stone, in the ring of Polyakov's name, on a silent diary, a new surname appeared. Tom has not yet returned to a straight line, and if someone were to reopen the old passage, the loop would start over again. The way out turned out to be deceptively simple. The crack in the rock, into which Malagen, Lyoka, Kostia, and Chermukin had burst out in a fit of despair, did not lead to the usual frosty morning under the biting northern wind. It was drawing them in. The damp, fresh air mixed with the familiar smell of lamp oil and burning. But the draft drove them not toward dawn, but along an invisible axis back into the ring where everything had already happened. Wait. Kostia stopped, sweating, although icy water was still running down the walls. Palak was just here. I saw him walking right behind me. Why is there no one here? They exchanged glances. Each of the three suddenly realized vaguely that he remembered Palak not as a companion at all, but rather as a random reflection on wet quartz. Words lost their usual meanings. Time, it seemed, was now simply jumping like a needle on an old record. Lyoka leaned his back against the wall, polished by other people's hands countless times. We didn't get out. We just went back in. And suddenly, the night light, as if they had been led their whole life along the trajectory of an old, hackneyed play. A meeting with their grandfather, great fear, an attempt to write their name in a notebook. Everything hung as if on the last unpainted sketch. No more faith in salvation. underscore. They went out into the hall with the altar again. Only now the objects on the pedestal were completely different. A charred helmet, a tourist token from 1963, a plastic cigarette case with the logo of the 1980 Olympics, a piece of a school diary with a red coat of arms seal that no longer knew any object. Chermukin suddenly threw his compass onto the slab. As soon as it touched the porous stone, the needle on the dial crumbled into silver dust, and the device itself fell through the altar, as if into a funnel or into another reality. The stone trembled, cracks spread across it. A moment, and darkness fell upon the group again, as if they had fallen into a deep whirlpool of their own memories. At that moment, a strange, ringing laugh rang out. Neither a child's nor an adult's, at the same time alien and so familiar, like an echo of the life that they all once left outside these walls. "We came for ourselves," whispered Kostya. "Nobody let us out. We sucked ourselves in." Now every movement seemed like déjà vu to them, frozen in the repetition of an endless circle. Entrance, corridor, altar, search for the exit. From the far side of the hall, right out of the shadows, a silhouette emerged. That same grandfather Kostya. Only now he looked cut up by time and someone else's memory. His face merged with the faces of dozens of previous inhabitants of this circle. Now an expression of empty peace, now a martyred grimace, now simply an empty mask in which there was no longer anything human. "Don't deceive yourself, Mikhail." This time his voice sounded like an echo in all the passages at once. "This is the end only for those who do not remember who they really were. The serpentine does not yell it. It waits for you to name your role in this choir." At that moment, Malagin remembered the expedition clearly. Not just the trip, but his entire chain of decisions and mistakes. How he linked his expectations of the expedition with his parental duty, how he drove the group forward, ignoring warning signs, how he himself, as a child, had once heard horror stories from his grandmother about lost gorges, where you can meet your own future if you can't forget the past. Underscore. The altar cracked, a couple of fragments fell. Lyoka suddenly jumped up, rushed to the far tunnel, to where the ghostly blue strip of light was hidden. He jumped through the shadows, stumbled, shouted, "There! I see. This is the city. This is 1990. I can go back." But the closer he got to the exit, the blurrier the details became. The walls were sprouting old, familiar foliage. The outlines of cracked asphalt appeared on the floor. Lyoka stumbled, and his hand dug into a metal plate he had found at random, with his own name and date. As soon as he raised his eyes, a young guy, painfully familiar, was walking towards him from the darkness, a reflection of himself, as he remembered himself at age 12. "You will still stay here," the mirror double whispered, "but only if you don't let go." At this time, Kostya was sitting at the altar, sorting through ancient coins and hiding in his fear. Behind each sign on these coins, there was a story of someone's death, a lost name, an unsent letter. He suddenly remembered a childhood story about a bird that flies after its reflection all its life and never finds home. It seemed that he himself had now become a great hero of such a fairy tale that no one would believe. Underscore. At that moment, Malagen realized that no doors would open as long as he held his past guilt in his hands and did not give it up. He stood by the stone slab and took out of his inside pocket that same old notebook in which his path had wound. Fatherly advice, petty fears, tapes with notes of missed opportunities. If this is my end, let not be a looping mistake, but a story for someone else. Malagen began to write. I, Mikhail Alexandrovich Malagen, entered here, not knowing that the loss of memory is the main punishment and the main favor of this circle. All my decisions were born from the fear of forgetting those who were before me and who will be after. If you are reading these lines, remember, do not hold on to your name. Do not be afraid to let go. Here, time is not your enemy, but an invisible friend giving a second chance to live differently. When he finished writing, the altar was enveloped in light, not bright, but such as the glow of a minute before the real dawn. Where the stove was smoking and the smell of real soup was present, Kostya suddenly turned around. In a high opening in the rock, he saw for a moment a man in a military uniform. He silently raised his hand in a farewell salute. It was grandfather, or now the new guardian of the circle, the caretaker of memory. When evening fell over the station, Lyoka tried to rewind the film. On it there was only a whitish shimmer, barely noticeable silhouettes, and a fragment of a line scratched on a dirty ruler. Time is a loop. Don't even think of closing it in yourself. And none of them ever returned to this story, although the cold, the rustling of the sand, and the gaze of the ghostly shadow would now always accompany them. And somewhere there, far underground, the serpentine was waiting for the next inquisitive soul to once again draw it into the inexorable circle. The chilly morning at the Geological Survey Station seemed surprisingly ordinary. The barracks smelled of burning, wet jackets and sticky soup on a limp electric stove. Pressed felt boot blocks were drying by the stove. A typewriter was quietly tapping in the corner. Chermukin, frowning, was trying to put the event log in order. September 18th, 1982, Expedition Number 14 returned to base. Of the 5 that went into the sector, 3 returned. The group is in a state of severe exhaustion. Some parts of the equipment are lost. The personal property of those missing was found. Palika's watch, an empty helmet, and an old notebook, the handwriting of which does not match that of any of the living members. He sat over this text for a long time, puffing out his cheeks. No one dared to ask the question, where is Malagen? They didn't even allow an official search. It was clear he wouldn't return. Chermukin knew that they wouldn't even look for him. In the Urals, if someone disappears in the hills or underground, it means that they are erased from memory, leaving only empty movement around. Outside in the yard, Kostya was stamping his feet, fingering a small lump of earth that he had dragged from the labyrinth for some reason. He was trying to discern some kind of secret there, or perhaps personal forgiveness. But the earth was silent, and inside he was aching with a sharp, persistent feeling, as if someone had cut the halves of his soul with an invisible thread. He sat down next to Lyoka. He was still turning the camera and the cassette from the expedition over and over again, hoping to see at least a shadow of the terrible circles they had passed. But the developed pictures showed only dirty streaks. Only one frame showed a thin line of light and a slightly blurred face, resembling both Grandpa Kostya and Malagen himself at the same time. Lyoka did not hope that anyone would ever understand this. 2. In the afternoon, a commission from the Regional Party Committee arrived at the station. Cold looks, stern questions, long paper protocols with empty lines for explanations. Did your boss risk not authorizing entry? Why did you leave without permission? Was there contact with the locals? Do you have a history of schizophrenia? Do you witness pressure? All the questions sounded like a flickering signal, as if asking what it was like to be a shadow of your own memory. Kostya couldn't explain anything clearly. He honestly said time was going wrong, but his words were immediately met with the doctor's silent nod, and a line appeared on the card. Expedition psychological trauma, sanatorium required. Lyoka spoke more and more muffledly. He hadn't slept for so many nights after Serpentine, locked in melancholy with his own reflection. From the diary that Shermuckin tried to keep for himself, it turned out that everything that happened in the dungeon seemed to have disappeared from the general consciousness. Only in the silence of the night, when the wind walked around the station, could quiet steps be heard behind the door. He knew for sure. These were not the guards or the commandant. These were those who could not leave the circle, and whose names were now difficult to pronounce, so as not to fall into oblivion. 3. A week passed. Early autumn began. The hospital beds of the station hospital accepted both survivors. Kostya was tormented by unreasonable nightmares in which he again and again went out into the hall with the altar and then saw himself writing his name next to 24 unknowns. Lyoka began to withdraw into himself. He would sit in the dark in the evenings and hear an unknown person scratching at the wallpaper behind the wall, as if in the next room.